Hello everybody. This video is going to be a very quick video about how stereotypes work. So kind of the process of stereotyping. So specifically we're going to talk about stereotype application and stereotype activation. So we'll start with the very first step of this process, and that's stereotype activation. So specifically what we mean by stereotype activation is when the content of a stereotype becomes accessible in memory. Now this can happen simply by encountering a member of a stereotyped group. So if you, let's say we're talking about the stereotype of nerds, and indeed you have a stereotype about literally every group of people. All right, every group of people that you've ever encountered, you have a stereotype about. All right, because a stereotype is really just your knowledge about a group. Sometimes that knowledge can be inaccurate, but most times it's not. Most times your stereotypes are more accurate than inaccurate. That unfortunately is one of the dirty truths of stereotypes. Are they always accurate? Absolutely not. Are stereotypes sometimes flat out wrong? They can be. But more times than not, stereotypes are more accurate than inaccurate. All right, and again, you have a stereotype about every group you've ever encountered or that you've ever heard of. So you've heard of nerds, you have a stereotype about nerds. You've heard of aborigines, you have a stereotype about aborigines. You've heard of martial artists, you have a stereotype about martial artists. So I don't know, about random. So you have a stereotype about every single group, but those stereotypes don't actually do anything until they're activated. And by activated, I mean they become accessible in memory. So first, in order for a stereotype to do anything, it has to be activated. So that's the first step of the process. So activation, again, as I've said, is just the information in your stereotype becoming more accessible in memory. Now, I started talking about what can cause activation. Well, again, encountering the stereotyped group. So if you see a nerd, that's going to activate your stereotype of a nerd. I use nerds because I'm a raging nerd. Doctor Who? Yeah. Okay. Doctor Who? No. Abbott and Costello? I'm a nerd. So I felt it's safe for me to use that particular stereotype. So let's say you see a nerd. It automatically, Dr. Doom, how could I not put Dr. Doom? So you see a nerd and it activates your stereotype of a nerd. Now that typically happens very automatically. You don't have to sit there and think about, what are you? Are you a nerd? I think you're a nerd. And suddenly your stereotype of a nerd becomes active. You don't have to do that. Stereotype activation happens fairly automatically, meaning it doesn't necessarily require you intend for that stereotype to become active. It just does. All right. Now, there is some evidence that it is not completely independent of resources. There's some evidence to suggest that if you are busy cognitively, meaning you're thinking about something, then if you're thinking about something and you don't have enough attention to pay to some cue of a stereotype, then the chances are that the cue of that stereotype won't activate the stereotype. You just don't have enough attention to pay to it. So you can't. So it can't get into, you don't attend to it. If you can't attend to it, you don't attend to it, and so it doesn't activate the stereotype. And so there's some evidence that things can prevent stereotype activation, but most of the evidence suggests that it proceeds fairly automatically. You see a cue of the stereotyped group and it activates the stereotype. So you see the person, activates a member of a stereotyped group, it activates the stereotype. You see some piece of information that reminds you of the stereotyped group. So if you were walking along and you saw that, all right, and you just happen to know that that's from Doctor Who, that might activate your stereotype of Doctor Who. You might, or your stereotype of nerds. You may not actually see a nerd around, but if you saw that and you thought, Doctor Who, that's a nerdy topic, that might activate your stereotype of nerds. So encountering a member of a stereotype group or encountering information that reminds you of a stereotype group, these things can both activate a group stereotype. Now, once application occurs, how it affects your behavior depends on how that stereotype gets applied. All right. So, do you apply the stereotype to? So, let's say you meet a nerd, and it activates the stereotype of a nerd. Do you then apply that stereotype to that individual? If you do, then you will typically probably interact with that person in a way that reflects what you think of nerds. All right, so you might ask them what they thought about the most recent superhero movie, or you might ask them whether they enjoy playing D&D, so things like that. Because in this situation, you have the stereotype of nerds activated in memory, and now you've applied it to the person, and that guides how you interact with that person. Now, activation also can proceed automatically, but it's far easier to control than activation. So application, A-P-P-L-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, application is also automatic, but more easily controllable than activation, A-C-T-I-V-A-T-I-O-N. All right? So application can be prevented. How? Well, application can be prevented, but it's not necessarily easy to do. There are a couple things that you need in order to prevent application. First, you need to be motivated. You have to be motivated to prevent application. So if you are, let's say, an egalitarian, egalitarianism refers to a general motive to treat all people equally. All right. So if you were if your egalitarian motivation were especially high, then you would have the motivation to not apply a stereotype. All right. And so therefore the chances of you not applying it grow, and the chances of you not interacting with them in stereotyped ways grows. Now, if you have the motivation, there's still a couple gates that you have to get through in order for you to prevent application. The second is time. If you're in a hurry and you don't have the time to really prevent application, to prevent using that stereotype to think about that person, then chances are you're going to use that stereotype. You're going to apply it because you don't have even though you don't want to, you don't have the time to do otherwise. So you go ahead and apply it. Because again, it's relatively automatic. You can stop it, but you have to be motivated to do so, and you have to have the time to do so. But even then, let's say you have the motivation and you have the time, even then, you still have to have the ability, right? You have to have the ability to prevent application. Now, that means you have to, in order to have the ability, a couple things have to be in place. First, you have to be aware that you might be applying a stereotype. You might be biased in the way you react to them based on what you think about their group. All right, so you have to be aware that you might be applying a stereotype. And then to appropriately prevent application, you need to know a little bit about how your application is biasing your behavior. So you need to know a little bit about how your preconceived notion, your stereotype about this group, is changing your behavior towards them. If you think you would ask literally anybody what they thought about the new superhero movie, then you won't think to not ask a nerd about what they thought about the most recent superhero movie. So you see, you need to know that you're being affected, and so in order to have the ability, you need to know that you're being affected and how you're being affected. So preventing application has to go. Several things are required. You have to be motivated to do so. You have to have the time to do so, and you have to have the ability to do so. All right, so there we go. So in this video, we've talked about the process of stereotyping. So first we have activation. The stereotype becomes accessible in memory, and it happens fairly automatically, provided we have the ability to attend to whatever it is that's making the stereotype active in memory, provided we have the ability to attend to the ability to attend whatever's activating the stereotype. And then we have application, in which we apply the stereotype to a person. Although I didn't mention this, sometimes we can apply the stereotype to ourselves, even if we're not in that stereotype group. But that's a conversation for another day. And if you're interested, send me an email. Now, if we want to prevent application, we can, but it requires we be motivated, we have the time to do so, and we have the ability to do so. And that, my friends, is it for this video. As always, if you have questions, please send them my way. But if not, take it easy.